17 years ago. Daniel Voss was nothing more than a broke single father who found a barefoot boy hiding behind a diner dumpster in the middle of a Houston ice storm and decided to bring him home. He gave him his last name, gave him a bunk bed next to his own daughters, and gave him a reason to believe that the world still had people in it worth trusting. 17 years later, that same man was hauled in front of a federal judge, branded a con artist, and told he was about to lose an $50 million freight and rail company. But when the courtroom doors finally opened, the boy from that frozen night walked in wearing a prosecutor's badge. If you love stories about quiet loyalty and courtroom reversals that come out of nowhere, hit subscribe and stay with us for what happens next. The storm hit Houston hard that February, the kind of ice storm the news warns about for days and the city never actually prepares for. Daniel Voss had just clocked out of a 16-hour shift hauling freight up from the port, and the cold had worked its way so deep into his hands that he could barely feel the keys in his pocket. He was 29 then, a widower with a 2-year-old daughter named Ruthie, asleep at his sister's apartment. And he wanted nothing in the world except a hot meal and 4 hours of sleep before the next shift. He was cutting through the alley behind Meyer's Diner to save 10 minutes on his walk when he heard it. Not crying, just breathing, ragged and shallow, coming from behind the dumpster. A boy, maybe 8 years old, was pressed into the gap between the dumpster and the brick wall, his jacket soaked through and his lips gone the color of a bruise. He had no shoes. He flinched hard when Daniel's flashlight found him, the flinch of a kid who had learned that hands reaching toward him rarely meant good things. Daniel didn't rush him. He'd grown up rough enough himself to know that a grown man moving too fast toward a scared child was its own kind of violence. He crouched down at a distance, kept his voice low and even, and asked the boy his name the same way he'd talked down a spooked dog. The boy finally said it was Marcus. Nothing more. Daniel called it in from the payphone outside the diner and asked for both an ambulance and child services because he wanted every single step of this done in the open, with witnesses, nothing hidden and nothing assumed. But he didn't leave the alley. He took off his own coat, wrapped it around the boy, and sat with him on the cold concrete until the sirens came. In the ambulance, wrapped in a thermal blanket with his teeth still chattering, Marcus looked at Daniel and asked him one question that would follow Daniel for the rest of his life. He asked, "Are you going to forget about me tomorrow?" Daniel didn't answer right away because he understood exactly what was being asked. It wasn't about tomorrow. It was about every day after that. It was a kid asking whether anyone ever would choose to keep him. The months that followed were built out of caseworkers and courtrooms and paperwork that never seemed to end. Daniel wasn't wealthy. He wasn't connected. He had nothing to gain and no one watching him do it, which was exactly why he kept doing it. He became Marcus's foster placement, then his legal guardian, and finally in a fluorescent-lit family court with a clerk who looked half asleep, his father. On the day it became official, Daniel knelt down, put a small brass key into Marcus's palm, and folded the boy's fingers around it. He told him something Marcus would repeat to himself 1,000 times over the next 17 years. He said, "This key means you've got a door that's always open. Storms don't get to decide who's inside it." That sentence became the spine of everything that came after. Years moved the way they always do, faster than anyone braces for. Daniel kept driving freight by day and by night sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, mapping out everything wrong with the industry he'd spent his whole life inside of. Trucks running half empty on return routes, warehouses sitting dark while orders backed up 2 states away, small haulers getting squeezed out because the big carriers hoarded routing data like it was gold. Daniel had lived inside every one of those wasted hours, and slowly, stubbornly, he started sketching out how a person might close the gaps. From a rented garage with a roof that leaked every spring, he built Voss Freight with 2 used trucks and a routing spreadsheet that Marcus and Ruthie helped him debug once they were old enough to type. What Daniel had that the bigger players didn't was earned, not learned. He'd been the driver, the loader, the guy waiting 3 hours at a dock for a manifest that never came. He built the company from that ground up, one kept promise at a time, and slowly his name became one that dispatchers and drivers up and down the Gulf Coast trusted without needing it in writing. Marcus grew up inside that world, and it left its fingerprints on him. He wasn't a soft kid hiding in the corner of the garage. He was the boy sitting on an overturned crate with a library book on constitutional law, while Daniel explained a shipping contract line by line, asking why it always seemed like the people with the least money were the ones who got buried by the fine print they never had time to read. Daniel didn't have a clean answer, but he gave Marcus the truest one he had. He told him, "You might not ever have much money, son, but don't you dare sign your name to something you haven't read to the last period." That sentence planted itself and grew for years until it became the whole shape of who Marcus decided to be. Marcus chose law, specifically the kind that put people like his father away for good, corporate fraud, the crimes committed in boardrooms instead of alleys. When the tuition bills came, Daniel sold his own truck, the very first one he'd ever bought outright, to help cover them, even though the company needed the cash badly that year. Ruthie, older now and fiercely protective of the brother she'd grown up sharing a bunk bed with, told her father, that if Marcus wanted to spend his life going after men like the ones who'd once let a kid freeze behind a dumpster, the whole family would find a way to pay for it. Over 17 years, Voss Freight grew into Voss Freight and Rail, an $850 million logistics company with cold storage terminals, a private short-line railway, and federal shipping contracts stretching from Houston to the Midwest. But the bigger the company grew, the more outside money Daniel had to let into his boardroom. And that, though he didn't know it yet, was where the trouble started. By the present day, Daniel Voss wasn't a broke trucker anymore. He owned a company that moved freight across 4 states and held federal contracts worth 9 figures. Yet he still drove himself to work in the same dented pickup, still wore steel-toed boots to the office, and still ate lunch on a milk crate out by the loading dock instead of in the glass-walled executive suite upstairs. To the drivers and dockhands, that made him a legend. To his board of directors, it made him an embarrassment. Preston Hale, chairman of the board, had decided a man who ate lunch with forklift operators had no business steering a company worth nearly $1 billion. Hale was smooth where Daniel was blunt, polished where Daniel was plain, and he'd come to see Daniel's habits not as loyalty but as a weakness ripe for exploiting. Hale quietly partnered with Regina Marsh, CEO of a private equity fund called Ashcombe Capital, a woman whose ambition was as sharp as her tailoring. Together, they built a plan to force Daniel out of control of his own company, buy his shares at pennies on the dollar, and fold the whole operation into Ashcombe's portfolio. Their plan was patient and vicious. Hale engineered a federal lawsuit built around an old defense freight contract, accusing Daniel of quietly siphoning company funds into a trust for his adopted son, the boy who shared none of his blood. The goal was simple: get a judge to freeze Daniel's voting control, push him out of the company he'd built from 2 second-hand trucks, and hand the wreckage to Ashcombe Capital at a fire sale price. It was cold, and it was calculated, and it was designed to twist the single most decent act of Daniel's life into proof of his corruption. What blindsided Daniel was that the documents produced against him carried a signature that looked exactly like his. The trust account set up years earlier in Marcus's name was reframed in the filing as evidence that Daniel had been bleeding the company dry to. Rich, a kid pulled off the street. The story broke, and the same people who'd once written glowing profiles about Daniel now called him a fraud hiding behind a sympathetic story. Ruthie wanted to fight back publicly and immediately. Daniel held her back with a hand on her shoulder, telling her the truth had its own momentum and would surface on its own if he didn't panic first. But what actually wounded him wasn't the threat to his fortune. He'd been poor before and knew he could survive it again. What cut him was watching them turn the worst night of a frightened kid's life into a liability on a spreadsheet. On the last evening before the hearing, a courier delivered a federal summons to his door. 72 hours until a judge decided the fate of everything he'd built. When the crisis broke, everyone who loved Daniel started looking for Marcus. He'd grown into a federal prosecutor based out of Washington, specializing in exactly the kind of white-collar fraud now being used to bury his own father. He was, by every measure, the one person alive best equipped to fight back. But at the exact hour Daniel needed him most, Marcus went dark. His office said only that he was traveling. His apartment sat empty. Calls went to voicemail, and the silence stretched long enough to breed real doubt. Had Marcus turned his back on the man who raised him to chase his own career? Had Ashcombe's money gotten to him first? Or was he hiding something of his own? Preston Hale seized on the silence like a gift and fed it straight to the press, remarking with practiced sorrow that even Daniel Voss's own adopted son wouldn't stand up for him, and that maybe that told you something about the family after all. Regina Marsh, in a brief interview delivered from a marble lobby, said an empire couldn't survive on sentiment and that Daniel's luck had finally run out. Daniel didn't blame Marcus. Alone in his study, he pulled out an old photograph. A shivering boy in a borrowed coat standing next to a toddler in her mother's arms outside a family courthouse. He told Louise Whitfield, the office manager who'd been with him for 15 years, that Marcus didn't owe him a thing. He hadn't taken the boy in expecting repayment. He'd taken him in because a child was freezing, and no math of gratitude had ever entered into it. That refusal to keep score made Daniel bigger in that dark hour, not smaller. What no one in Houston knew was that Marcus hadn't vanished out of fear or betrayal. He was 3 states away, working through the sealed archive room of a shuttered law firm, hunting for the original copy of a founder's trust document that Louise had once been trusted to safeguard. And in that search, he found something that reshaped the entire case. The fund in his name had never been company money siphoned off for personal gain. It was a founder's protective trust, established years before the company ever answered to outside shareholders, built for one purpose only: to shield the company's founding principles from exactly the kind of predators now circling it. Late on the second night, in a records room thick with dust, Marcus found what he'd come for: a sealed box, edges soft with age, and across the front in his father's own handwriting, words he read 3 times before he let himself believe them. It read, "For Marcus Voss." Open when the court finally asks who this company really belongs to. He sat on the cold floor with the box in his lap, and for the first time in 17 years, the frozen boy from the alley and the federal prosecutor became the same person again. The hearing opened in federal court on a gray Tuesday, the room formal and cold and thick with pressure. Daniel sat at the defense table beside a court-appointed attorney who had inherited a case bigger than he understood, while across the aisle Preston Hale commanded a row of expensive lawyers led by Desmond Price, a litigator famous for strangling opponents with the very contracts they'd signed. Judge Rosalind Thorne presided, sharp, unbribable, with a reputation for throwing out cases from men far richer than Hale, and she asked both sides to state their positions plainly. At issue, whether Daniel Voss had misused company assets to fund a private trust, and whether his voting control should be frozen while the matter was resolved. Desmond Price opened like a man holding a winning hand. He put the wire transfers on the screen, then the trust documents, then Daniel's signature blown up wall size, and finally, deliberately, the adoption papers. He painted Daniel as a sentimental man who let affection cloud his judgment and quietly funneled company assets to the boy he'd taken in. It wasn't just an attack on Daniel's finances. It was an attack on his character, turning the kindest act of his life into a weapon against him. Price asked Daniel directly, in front of a packed gallery, whether he had adopted a boy named Marcus Voss. Daniel said he had. Price asked whether he had established a fund in that boy's name. Daniel said he had. A murmur rolled through the courtroom, and within minutes the story was already breaking online that the founder had confessed. Preston Hale allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Regina Marsh sat in the back gallery with the stillness of a woman who'd already read the ending. Daniel's attorney rose to argue the trust was lawful and legitimate, but without the original document in hand, his words sounded thin, and the judge's face didn't change. The room was tilting hard against Daniel, and the machinery of the law was grinding slowly toward freezing him out of the company he'd built. Judge Thorne looked up and asked if the defense had any further witnesses or evidence. Daniel's attorney said nothing. The back door stayed shut, and then, just as the judge lifted her pen to sign the order, those doors opened. A man in a dark suit walked in carrying a worn leather case, and he didn't rush and he didn't look rattled. He walked straight to the clerk's table and said, in a clear, even voice, "Marcus Voss, appearing pro hac vice on behalf of the defense. I'm moving to submit emergency evidence." The room went quiet. Daniel turned in his seat, and for one suspended second he didn't see a lawyer at all. He saw a barefoot 8-year-old shivering behind a dumpster, asking if anyone would remember him tomorrow. Marcus didn't let the moment shake him. He stood straight, chin level, voice steady, and waited for the court the way any officer of the law would. Desmond Price was on his feet immediately, objecting that Marcus Voss had an obvious conflict of interest as the defendant's own adopted son. Marcus answered without a flicker of heat, pointing out that since the plaintiffs had made his identity and his adoption the very center of their case, he had every right to appear both as a witness to the truth and as counsel on the terms of the trust itself. Judge Thorne, after a long look at both sides, allowed him to proceed. Marcus opened the leather case and produced the original Voss family founders trust, drafted years before the company ever answered to a board. He walked the court through its language line by line, and that language proved the opposite of what the plaintiffs claimed. Daniel hadn't diverted company money to his son. He placed a portion of his own founding shares into a protective trust specifically to stop the board from ever selling the company against the principles it was built on. The fund wasn't theft. It was a wall. Marcus turned toward Preston Hale and said without raising his voice, "The question was never what my father took out of this company. The question is who's trying to sell something that was never theirs to sell." Marcus's next piece of evidence drew a scoff from Price. A handwritten letter Daniel had written the day the adoption became official. Price argued a sentimental note carried no legal weight. Marcus was ready. He showed that the letter hadn't been kept as a keepsake. It had been formally incorporated by reference into the trust document itself, giving it the full force of law. He read it aloud, and the room went still. Daniel had written that he'd lost people before and wouldn't stand by while a kid got left behind for lacking a name or money. He wrote that the trust wasn't meant to make Marcus rich. It existed to protect the company from men who would one day try to strip it for parts. Buried in it was a line that reached across 17 years and landed directly in that courtroom. If the board ever used Marcus's past as a weapon against the family, that act alone would prove they'd betrayed the company's founding purpose, and the trust protections would activate at that exact moment. The clause Marcus pointed to stated plainly that if the founder were attacked through a manufactured accusation tied to his family, in service of a hostile takeover, emergency voting authority would pass to the trust's name protector, a role assigned years earlier to Marcus himself, effective once he held a law license. Price objected that the clause had long since lapsed. Marcus produced the annual renewal filings, submitted on schedule every single year by Louise Whitfield. Louise was called to the stand and confirmed, under oath, that Daniel had always filed the renewals transparently, and that Preston Hale had deliberately buried those filings from the rest of the board, so that when his lawsuit arrived, no director would remember the trust had ever been legitimate. Regina Marsh's composure cracked at the edges because she understood before anyone else that if the clause held, her entire acquisition collapsed. Marcus then stopped defending and started attacking. He presented internal messages between Hale and Marsh, in which the two of them discussed applying legal pressure to drive down Voss Freight's stock price ahead of Ashcombe's formal offer. They'd referred to Daniel as the trucker with the sentimentality problem, and to Marcus as the leverage. Price argued the messages had been altered. Marcus was ready for that too, entering the metadata, the digital signatures, and an independent forensic certification. Then he produced a wire transfer from a shell entity tied to Ashcombe Capital into a consulting account belonging to Preston Hale, dated the exact same day Hale filed the lawsuit. No coincidence a judge could believe. For the first time all day, Hale had no answer. Marcus followed it with the minutes of a private meeting in which Hale had promised Marsh that once Daniel's voting rights were frozen, the board would sell 51% of the company at 40% below its true value. A plan that wouldn't just cost Daniel his company, it would gut every employee and shareholder who depended on it. Regina Marsh, refusing to go down quietly, directed her legal team to attack Marcus's own credibility, walking him back through the worst nights of his childhood in open court, hoping to paint him as too indebted to his father to be objective. Marcus didn't flinch. He admitted all of it. The alley, the years without a home, the tuition his father paid without hesitation. Then he turned it into his sharpest point yet. He said a debt is something you repay to be free of it, but a promise is something you keep because of who you've chosen to become. He hadn't walked into that courtroom to repay anything. He'd walked in because the documents in his hands were true, and the truth didn't need his gratitude to make it real. Then came the piece no one saw coming. Marcus revealed that Regina Marsh had reached out to him before the hearing through an intermediary, offering him a partner-track position at a major firm and a substantial payout on one condition: that he simply not show up in court. Marcus had recorded the meeting legally, in full compliance with the recording laws of the state where it took place, because the instinct his father had built into him told him to protect the truth before he ever needed to use it. The recording played. The intermediary's voice said plainly, "Ashcombe doesn't need you to turn on your father, we just need you to stay quiet." That did more damage than any spreadsheet, because it exposed the real shape of the plan. They'd never needed Marcus's betrayal. They'd only needed his silence. And now that silence had been broken open for the whole court to hear. Daniel looked at Marcus with a father's pride tangled up with a father's grief, finally understanding what those missing days had actually cost his son. Judge Thorne entered the recording into the record and issued a sharp warning about witness interference. With the Founders Protection Clause validated, the manufactured fraud exposed, and the payment trail undeniable, Judge Thorne ruled from the bench. Daniel's voting authority would not be frozen. The Ashcombe acquisition was suspended immediately. Preston Hale was removed from every decision touching Voss Freight and Rail. Marcus Voss was formally recognized as protector of the Founders Trust for the duration of the investigation. Regina Marsh tried to leave and was ordered to stay, warned she might face her own charges over witness tampering. Daniel bowed his head, not from defeat, but because he understood exactly who had just saved his life's work. Outside in the marble hallway, there were no dramatic tears, because both of them had lived through too much to turn the moment into a show. Daniel finally said the thing that had been sitting in his chest for days. "I thought I'd lost you." Marcus answered evenly, "You taught me that. When someone builds a trap at the front door, you find your way in through the back." Daniel apologized for letting Marcus's past get dragged through open court like an exhibit. Marcus told him it wasn't his fault, that people like Hale and Marsh always assumed a hard beginning was something to be ashamed of, when really it was proof he understood the value of a locked door and a promise kept better than either of them ever would. Ruthie appeared at the end of the hall and pulled her brother into a hug, telling him she'd known all along he'd come through. Daniel asked why Marcus hadn't warned him before disappearing. Marcus said if his father had known, he would have spent every ounce of strength trying to protect him and might have tipped their enemies off before the evidence was secure. This time, Marcus said, he'd wanted to be the one doing the protecting. 17 years earlier, Daniel had walked into Marcus's life at the exact moment he had no one left. 17 years later, Marcus walked into a courtroom at the exact moment his father was about to lose everything. Daniel's voice went rough. "I didn't take you in so you'd owe me this." Marcus answered, "I know. You just taught me that family doesn't stay outside in the cold." They stood together in the quiet hallway, a father and son with no blood between them and something stronger holding them together anyway. In the weeks after, the board was rebuilt from the ground up. Preston Hale faced formal charges for fraud, witness interference, and taking payments tied to Ashcombe Capital, and the reputation he'd spent decades polishing came apart in days. Regina Marsh lost the acquisition and became the subject of a federal inquiry that would follow her for years. Desmond Price quietly withdrew from the case, which turned out to be the most honest thing he'd done in the entire proceeding. Daniel came back to run the company, but not alone this time, because he'd learned the hard way what isolation could cost a man. He put Ruthie in charge of operations, the work she'd always loved best. He asked Louise to oversee the transparency of every filing going forward, so nothing could ever again be buried in the dark. And he brought Marcus on as special counsel to the Founders Trust, not as a family favor, but because Marcus had proven he'd defend the company from anyone who tried to twist a contract into a weapon. Marcus accepted on one condition. that he'd answer to the document and to the truth and nothing else. Daniel gathered the whole company at the same loading dock where he'd once worked as a broke driver with frostbitten fingers. Standing in front of the drivers, the dispatchers, and the office staff, he told them the short version of a frozen night behind a diner years before. He didn't tell it to show off his own decency, and he made that clear. He told it so every person on that dock would remember the one rule the company had been built on, that nobody working under the Voss name would ever be left out in the cold because they didn't have money or power or the right last name. Marcus stood beside him as he spoke, no longer the barefoot kid from the alley, but the man who'd used the law itself to protect his family and the thousands of families whose paychecks depended on it. The story closed on an ordinary morning at the dock, the sky clear for once, gulls circling over the rail yard. Daniel watched the trucks pull out in long convoys, watched the containers swing up onto the rail cars, watched the business he'd built out of nothing carry on exactly the way it was supposed to. Marcus walked up beside him and pressed something small and cold into his palm. It was the old brass key, the same one Daniel had folded into an 8-year-old's fist 17 years earlier. Marcus had kept it the whole time. He said, "You gave me a key when I didn't have a door. Today I'm just handing you back the key to everything you built with it." Daniel turned the worn metal over in his fingers, then slipped it into the pocket of the same old jacket he'd worn from the loading dock to the boardroom and back again. The company was still his, safe and whole. But more than that, the promise he'd made on a frozen night outside a diner, that nobody in his family would ever be left standing in the storm, remained exactly as unbroken as the day he first made it.